Joining me now from Melbourne is Greg Sheridan, the highly esteemed foreign editor of the Australian newspaper. Well, Greg, welcome to the McGregor Angle.
Thanks, Catherine.
Submarines. You and I have been following this closely for a long time. Have you ever seen an announcement around which the OPSEC, operational security, has been as good as this? It certainly blindsided all of us who thought that the nuclear option was simply not on the table. I was completely blindsided, and I know some senior members and committee members of the government were as well. What do you make of it all?
Well, Catherine, you're right. The fact that the American, British and Australian administrations were able to keep the thing secret is miraculous and the highest level of operational competence that I've seen from anything.
Me too.
So look, I'm not in the habit of slavishly quoting Gareth Evans, but he made a pretty good point today when he said there's been some world-class hyperbole about this agreement. I think it's a tribute to Scott Morrison and Joe Biden and Boris Johnson that they've got the world to take this agreement quite so seriously. I mean, you've had learned editorials in The Economist saying this changes everything and so on. But as far as I knew, we were already very intimate intelligence and defence technology partners of the Americans. Every Prime Minister I can remember has told me that things are more intimate than they've ever been in the past. And all those new technologies this agreement talks about, we've been working on with the Americans anyway. The only new thing in this agreement is the nuclear sub. That's enormously important. But having, Catherine, I'm only kind of quite new at this journalism gig. I've only been a professional journalist for 42 or 43 years. I'll have to decide soon whether to make it a career or not. And the only Prime Minister in my lifetime who has commissioned a new sub which has actually come into existence is Bob Hawke. Every subsequent Prime Minister has talked about subs and nothing has happened. So I'm tremendously in favour of the nuclear subs. I think that's fantastic, but if this goes on a normal defence timeline, you and I will be, sitting on the back porch of our homes for the perpetually bewildered before the thing even swings into sight. And I just don't think we can. And although I think the Morrison government is moving in the right direction and all of that, and they're better on national security than the other guys would be, and Peter Dutton is a good defence minister. Nonetheless, I'm just not prepared to pay out on airy announcements anymore. This is a real thing. When there's a boat, when there's a nuclear-powered boat with an Australian flag on it, this is a real program. And until then, I think we can maintain healthy scepticism, sad to say.
Yeah, look, and you made those points eloquently this week, along with an appropriate rebuke, in my view, to former Prime Minister Paul Keating. And again, you and I both gave him credit where it was due. He's a substantial figure. But his and Kevin Rudd's contributions were frankly bizarre. You know quite well as I do, that we host very substantial capabilities at Pine Gap. That is not... they, as Prime Ministers, they would have been privy to highly compartmented information. We as lay people know that those bases exist and that the ground station network of the United States trumps any platform purchase that we make in terms of making us a major target for an adversary of the United States. Take us through why you were so incensed at what Keating had to say about his contemporary Labor friends on their response to this, what I thought was a totally sound announcement last week.
Yes, you're right, Catherine. Look, I would distinguish Rudd from Keating, though. There have been three responses from Labor elder statesmen on this. Gareth Evans, perfectly sensible. Too many words, 1,000 words in search of a sentence, normal stuff, but perfectly sensible. Bit of throat clearing about independence from Americans, but it's a necessary capability, we should get it. The burden of Rudd's contribution was to abuse the government for upsetting the French. Well, I think Rudd is mistaken to make that argument, but who cares? I didn't see in Rudd's piece any objection to nuclear propulsion, nor any in principle objection to going down this path with the Americans. So Rudd is a much more current figure on foreign policy than Keating. And I think the friends of the nuclear submarine are well advised to distinguish Evans and Rudd from Keating. Now, Keating is a tragic figure, I think, and I'm sad to be writing so critically of him because I think he's in many ways a great figure in Australian public life. But he is now two things about him. First of all, he simply refuses to recognise the reality of modern China. I mean, he's ridiculous when he says there's nothing to fear in China. This is just absurd. So I think that's absurd. But secondly, Keating is betraying the very principles that he espoused when he was Prime Minister. Keating is now on a unity ticket with Dr. Mahathir, claiming that one notional nuclear-powered submarine by Australia sometime in the late 2030s constitutes an arms race because of its connection with the Americans. Whereas when Keating was Prime Minister, his ferocious disagreement with Mahathir was over the centrality of America and its security commitment to the Asian region. And as you say, Catherine, the joint facilities that we have always made us a primary target in a nuclear war or a big conventional war that the United States might be involved in. Keating was an intimate member of the government and then Prime Minister.
Absolutely.
When Hawke and Beazley updated the joint facilities, when they stared down the anti-nuclear stuff which led to New Zealand withdrawing from ANZUS, Keating was profoundly committed to the American alliance. Now, he has repudiated all those values. He's like a Labor version of Malcolm Fraser. He has repudiated. He is not today giving expression to the pro-Asian values he expressed as Prime Minister, because that always involved good, deep sense on security and pro-the American alliance. He has now become a sour, bitter, unhappy contributor to Australian public life, who seems to recognise only two forces for good in the world, the Chinese Communist Party and the Keating government. And I think it's a pity that this is where he's ended up. He does, however, have the potential to do a lot of damage to the Labor Party, and his personalised attack on Penny Wong was bizarre. But the very next day, Labor was then sort of making kind of silly noises about does having a nuclear-propelled sub compromise our sovereignty? Well, does having the F-35 compromise our sovereignty, or the Super Hornets, or the Growlers, which Kevin Rudd bought as Prime Minister? It's an absurd argument on its face. And hopefully he'll just be regarded as a grumpy old man.
I think you're right, and he has betrayed a lot of the work that he did as a young Labor stalwart, fighting against those elements who were against those joint facilities. He was part of the Whitlam legacy to the Labor movement, was ending that lunacy that Caldwell and others had pioneered. Greg, just to close this out, we've seen Afghanistan fall. You and I, over many years, were sceptics about nation-building counterinsurgency. It's time, is it not, now to recalibrate our investments? Every cent we spend on land platforms, especially tanks and armoured vehicles, is money that should be being channelled into sea-skimming missiles and ballistic missiles. Are we in agreement on that?
Oh, absolutely, Catherine. I think you're 100% right. And, we have a long history on these issues, which we could divert people who had eccentric interests with. But look, that is the truth. We've just wasted $2.5, $3 or $4 billion on the French subs. Okay, fair enough. Now, it almost certainly means that we delay in getting any subs, but if we get nuclear subs at the end of it, that was a reasonable decision. We're spending a couple of $1 billion on tanks. We haven't used a tank or deployed a tank in a contested area since the Vietnam War. We're spending tens of billions of dollars on armour. We're going to build most of our naval ships in Australia, and the Morrison government even says we're going to build these nuclear subs in Australia. Now, that adds tens and tens and tens of billions of dollars of extra cost. I'm not against it nonetheless, because I think it's very hard to sustain your political constituency for defence if you don't do a lot of stuff in Australia. But given all that, that means that our notional defence budget is actually spent much less effectively, much less efficiently than it should be spent. Therefore, as Morrison and even Gareth Evans said today, we need to increase our defence budget. I absolutely agree with that. But we must have a ruthless discipline about the capabilities we acquire. We have to acquire asymmetric capabilities which would raise the cost to a potential maritime aggressor, that is to say China, in taking action against us or our allies. So that means, as you say, missiles, 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 which are the common coin of modern defence. It means unmanned underwater vehicles. It means lots and lots of offensive drones which can swarm an enemy. It means more fighter jets than we've got. The idea that you could defend Australia with 100 fast jets is ridiculous. And as you know better than me, we don't have enough sailors to crew our 6 subs. We don't have enough pilots to crew our 100 fighter jets. We haven't expanded the Defence Force for years and years and years. So tragically, I think the defence bureaucracy has imposed its paradigm on the government, even though the government claims we're in a desperate situation. But we're not taking, or maybe not a desperate situation, but an urgent situation. We are simply not taking urgent action, and we are still wasting prodigious amounts of money on things which don't contribute to our maritime capabilities.
Yeah, Greg, as always, wonderful to hear your exposition of these events. Thank you for joining us this evening.